number of readings today, the Good Samaritan, probably the parable from the New Testament that the most people are most familiar with, right? Even if they aren't very religious people, they know this story. And this is all about who is my neighbor, which is to say, who do I have obligations to? Who do I owe things to? And it's really a question about the nature of of my relationships with other people, right? I mean, this is really what this question is getting at, is what is the nature of my, how I relate to other people? And what we get specifically is the question, how is it do I relate to other people, specifically those people who don't have anything to give back to me, right? Or maybe I don't feel like, or maybe if I don't oblige whatever needs they have, there's very little consequences that come back to me for, not doing that. If, my child is hungry and I don't feed them, maybe eventually, someone will call like protective services on me. But if I don't feed the guy who's homeless sitting on the side of the street and I step over him, there's no consequences for that. And so that's really the nature of what we're talking here. And the question of who my neighbor is comes from this great commandment. We see with this lawyer, he answers rightly, but is still wrong, right? He knows what the right answer is, but one, he's failed to actually understand what that commandment of to love my neighbor as myself actually means, and he's also failed to put that into practice. And so we have this question in the other gospel reading, where Jesus is then sitting with tax collectors and sinners, right? And so really what you're getting, and he gets criticized for like, why are you doing this? Why are you spending time with these people? Really, why are you in any sort of relationship with them? And so what we have here is an example of our desire and need as human beings to draw lines, right, of who's in and out in our life, right? Something that's very common today, it seems far more common than when I was a young person, is how people so quickly cut people out of their life, right? Because they're toxic, right? Or something like this, right? Usually people who I hear who cut people out of their lives because they're toxic are often also toxic people, right? And so, people who quickly cut out, or just the phenomenon of like ghosting, people just disappear, from other people. And so this is sort of this quick reflex to sort of breach or sever any sort of obligations, to quickly draw a line, like no longer you, that's what I'm doing here. And we see in the case with Jesus, this is what's also going on. They're upset because they're like, well, these are people you don't have to love, you don't have to give your time to, you shouldn't extend any sort of mercy or kindness to. And Jesus at the very end of this says, he says basically, try to understand this. God desired sacrifice and not mercy. And we're not given an answer to that at the very end of the gospel reading. We're just said, God desired sacrifice and not mercy. One thing we realize is that when we talk about sacrifice here, we're talking specifically in this context about sort of like temple sacrifices or ritual obligations. And so what sacrifice stands in here for is my love for God, right? And so what we're getting here is, but mercy is this extension of love towards my neighbor. And so what these mercy and sacrifice, at least in this particular story, stand in for is, God says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, is that he's emphasizing that the way that you love God most truly is by loving the things that he loves most, which is your neighbor, right? Which is the person next to you. And also exposes this problem, and this tendency that you can't love God and not love your brother. This also comes up in the epistles in John. It says, the man who says he loves God but hates his brother is a liar, right? And it also in John, he says, the greatest love a man can have is that he lays his life down for his friends. And so we're given this example of what love is. And so in the great commandment, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, they're these twin loves, right? Like you can't separate them, right? To love God, right, means to love other people, right? And it's very difficult to love other people well if you're not also loving God. Like these are wrapped up together and are not really separable. But we do like to separate them. And so he's calling out a kind of religious hypocrisy where people feel self-satisfied like this lawyer, where religion is not an occasion to love other people. Religion is an occasion to maybe boost your status, to boost your own self-esteem, your own sense of like, it's really this, it's I'm a good person, right? We want to feel better about ourselves. But like our spiritual ancestors did not make all these sacrifices for us so that we could be here and have this tradition given to us so that we could have better feelings. Like we're not here so we can feel nice, right? We're here to be different and to live different lives, which the gospel calls us and reminds us what that means is that God doesn't just desire sacrifice, right? And this is appropriate entering into the fast, right? Like if I fast really well, but I'm a jerk the whole time, right? I broke my fast, right? If I fast and I pray long vigils, but I don't acquire humility or kindness or patience or any other virtues, then I'm a fool. I'm wasting my time. Like I've missed the whole point of everything we're doing. And this lawyer who comes up to Jesus to put him to the test is also missing the point. And Jesus, very craftily sort of shames and traps him, even though he's trying to trap Jesus, and exposes this. And at the end he says, who was the real neighbor, right? Is the one who showed mercy. But we realize this is that mercy is itself always a sacrifice. If you look at the Good Samaritan, in order to show mercy upon the man who's beaten and left for dead on the side of the road, he had to make sacrifices. He had to change his schedule. He had to inconvenience himself. He had to take the man to the inn. He had to pay for the man's expenses, right? It cost him something to show mercy on somebody else. And he did that. The Levite and the priests who were passing by, they passed by in order to probably get on to business so they could make the right sacrifices in the temple, but they completely neglected the duty of mercy to their brother, and so missed the whole point of sacrifices to God is so that we can learn to love God in other people, right? Like this is right at the heart of the gospel and what Jesus is trying to teach during his ministry. And so we see a good example here. Now we can connect this to the lessons from Paul from the epistles. The Levite and the priest passed by on their side, right? The mercy that they wanted to extend them was not easy, right? They were busy. They would have to have given something up. But this is the point that Paul is making, right? When he boasts about all of his infirmities and all the hardships that he's been through, right? And it's this, is that, obedience isn't a virtue if you don't obey when you don't feel like it, right? Chastity and virginity are not virtues if no one wants to have sex with you, right? Patience isn't a virtue unless there's anyone there to annoy you, right? It's only in the deprivation, right? Like Paul talks about, that virtues matter. What is generosity if I'm not giving out of my need? If I'm a billionaire and I give $100,000, what is that? It is not generous, right? The widow who gives the mite, right? She's the generous woman because the virtue is found, right? In the deprivation, in the difficulty, in the need, right? That's where it's tested. Comes right back to Jesus' words where he says, what does it spiritually profit a man if he lends to those to whom he knows will give back to them, right? He goes, for even the Gentiles do this, right? And he goes on to say, I tell you, rather, pray for those who persecute you and, love your enemies, right? He gives this command. And it's the whole point is that, there's no spiritual credit or gain unless something is done that stretches us and pushes us, that requires some sort of sacrifice. And so mercy is itself a sacrifice. And Jesus is not doing anything actually terribly new. You can go back to the prophet Malachi, right? Where the prophet Malachi prophesies and says, your whole burnt offerings, right? Your sacrifices are an abomination to me. They are a stench that rises to heaven, because this is what the Lord God requires of you, to love mercy, to do justice, and to walk humbly with your God, right? So our gathering in prayer here, our singing of hymns, our fasting, all of our spiritual exercises, they are stench and rot if they are not accompanied with virtue and sacrifice and mercy for our neighbor. And who is our neighbor? We see this clearly in the Good Samaritan. It's anybody God puts in our life at any point. That's our neighbor. And you see this is the radical proclamation of the gospel, that it takes the tribe and expands it to the very edges of the universe. And so there is not anybody whom we do not have the privilege of having an obligation to show mercy to. And this is what makes Christianity very difficult, and the sayings of Jesus hard sayings, because we realize how far we have to go. But this is also the truth too, is that the measure of a saint, right, is not the person who sins the least, right, but the person who repents the most, right? The saint isn't the person who never falls, it's the person who always gets back up. And so I could be, and this is the thing, it's like maybe I was born with a great life and I had the right sort of like cards dealt to me. And so then what is my virtue, my character, and my spiritual success? I don't have addictions, I don't have these sins. Well, good for you, it's like I'm playing golf, but I'm starting halfway down the fairway from you. So of course I'm going to get a better score than you are in your life. And so, but that's not the measure, right? We see what the measure is not how high you farm, but it's from wherever you happen to be, right? How much progress have you made from that point? This is what Paul means when he says, like, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And so the real mark of like our spiritual progress is not how high we've climbed, but how high we've climbed from where we started. And so that can mean somebody who is, at least for all exterior appearances, can look far more put together and holy and righteous and have far fewer sins, right? In a technical sense, and yet be the less holy person than someone whose life is more messy. Because Jesus looks to the heart, right? Looks and sees right into it and sees all the ends and all the context and all the roads that led to this point, and is able to make that right judgment on that person. And so this is an encouragement to us that even if I'm starting from a low place, even if I've fallen to a very, low level, that if I turn my heart in repentance, right, that distance that I'm able to cross, like, is possible. And so in many ways, if I'm starting from the bottom, I have all the more grace and opportunity to become a saint because of that. And so this gives us a clear indication of this gets us back to what Paul was talking about with all of his trials and tribulations, right? We see his devotion and love for God so clearly because he has suffered so much for it. He has been tested, and the love of his heart that's internal and hidden has been proved and brought out and exposed into the light. And we've seen the great love that Paul has. And so when we enter into a period of fasting where we're going to increase our giving and our fasting and our prayer and all these things, we are voluntarily taking on these hardships, right? So that we can intentionally put ourselves in a place of deprivation and need. And therefore, in that place of need, we have the opportunity to actually excel in virtue, in love. Because we're in a place of, you could say, weakness, that we're able to be so strong. And so this is the way of the gospel that transforms us in the remembrance of our neighbor. So in the midst of this fast, the ultimate point and goal is always we're fasting so that we can love more truly. Glory to Jesus Christ.